to deliver their speech. Here. Yeah. I know. We kind of collegiate. No. You're here.
Speaker, there is a value to understanding ordinary people. On proposition today, we're not going to contest that. What we are going to say, and what we propose, is that the way to study history and the way to understand these movements is not through looking at the ordinary person and treating that as the lens through which we therefore understand history. You could only actually look at the great movers and shakers of history and understand how they were responsible for, in situations where people lacked freedom in many cases, changing and actually influencing the way that lives were lived in a meaningful manner. That's our advocacy on proposition today. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. First, explain what types of figures we think fall under this conception. Talk about then how this creates the better understanding of history that I just alluded to. Finally, how the alternative leads to disaffection with the study of history and disaffection with it writ large. So many types of figures. Who do we think is really at play in this debate? Because there are two types. There's the first type of the classical idea of a great figure or institution in society like Caesar, George Washington. We think these are the types of individuals that you're also going to study. But we think as well, we have an understanding and conception of society and throughout history that individuals that were not considered a great figure at the time of their life can become one in the study of history. What is this like? Well, we're very near to Seneca Falls. I think that's probably a perfect example of later in life recognizing that figures like Harriet Tubman, for example, were incredibly important figures and therefore were the ones that we should also consider in this academia, if you will. So the point being, at the point when you can study these figures versus actually just simply there's just a lot of information about these individuals versus reading through a couple diaries and therefore claiming that you have an accurate historical understanding of what actually occurred at that time period because one person scribbled it on the back of a page, we would prefer this world. Let me then talk about the unique benefits in terms of a better understanding of history. So we would just simply posit that throughout the course of time, really little people, like some of us in this room maybe, have actually very little power. Maybe that'll change later, I don't know. The point being, if you were a serf, if you were going to go to the castle for protection, we don't think you were going to be able to shape that democracy or shape that constitution in any meaningful manner. What does this mean? At the point when you are, as an individual, or as a collective body, lacked any cultural or political power because you were necessarily dependent on the institutions that existed in order to actually live in many cases or to protect you from the crusaders that were coming against your king, you probably have more of a loyalty to that great figure than to actually creating any cultural identity in of yourself. What we tell you then is it's not like regular people really change that much. So if we want to understand how these changes occurred and how regular people in the status quo, part of the issue in this round is our bias. Regular people right now have Twitter. They can do a lot of different things. That didn't necessarily exist through the entire canonical study of history. The point being, at the point when this did not exist, if we want to understand how you get to the Twitter stage of humanity, you have to understand how we get to this form of democracy, which necessitates understanding the democratic leaders that got us there in the first point. Note, studying George Washington, he's a pretty cool guy. Watching Hamilton as a musical would probably fit under our model as well. So, further on this, there's just relatively little information about ordinary citizens. So at the point when you want to gain a better understanding, no, that's not good for you, David. At the point when you want to gain a better understanding of what actually happened, I'll talk about this now. I think it's really interesting. Shut up, David. There is a problem with the validity of history studying as an institution at the point when you just have relatively little information about another issue. And it's not like that information is suddenly going to arise in a credible manner. It's not going to pop out of thin air because you actually have to go look for that journal page in order to actually understand if you want to do what they want to do on their side of the house. What does this mean? Well, there's probably a problem with people perceiving history and the study of it as not valid. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so yes, individual little people might by themselves not have a lot of power, but was the American Revolution won by John Adams writing some papers or by a bunch of people taking up arms and fighting the British?
The Constitution was one. I firmly believe that Hamilton saved the Constitution by writing it. Like, that's a pretty important thing to study. I firmly believe that George Washington was probably the leader that was like, let's cross this river today, young people. Like, I don't think that we actually had an understanding that that was the individual army themselves that was responsible for the American Revolution, and I think it would be absurd to posit that on your side of the house. But let's continue. Like, if you're going to want to study it, you're going to have to look into that individual soldier's journal, which may have like rotten in a half or something. At that point, maybe a little extreme, maybe rotten in a corner. Like, the point being, people that are the ones, like we study history in order to understand, in part, where we are in the status quo and how we got here and how the institutions are shaped. The people, we posit, that would be most receptive to this study are unlikely to be receptive at the point when it is not viewed as a valid work, or when it is viewed as a work that is simply just being created by the history professor at some elite academic institution that went and did that research, and then at another school, like maybe Harvard does something, and then Stanford does another thing. Like, who do you believe at that point? It is much easier to actually understand the institutions and the great figures. Yeah, sure.
So, when England was founded in 1066, there was an average of 6 documents in total about any sort of thing. Given that we think it's so valid to study that because we think it was a valuable contribution, how is that any different to lives of little people?
It's different. Like, that little people are different than 6 documents. Little people are all different than the kings that shaped England. Like, maybe I'm missing something. You'll have to explain it. I'm American. Let's talk then about the disconnection with study of history. First off, history can be quite inspiring. Studying great figures can be incredibly inspiring. Like, you recognize like why people love the history and become history majors, because they love institutions and power structures, and that is a draw in of itself that adds merit to the study of history. Secondly, we also would posit that it's more interesting. So for the last half of a minute, we'll talk about how studying great figures is more interesting, right? Like, at the point when a great figure has actually done something with their lives and actually is responsible for changing an institution in a way that we think you can create a direct causal link between that change and the way that you are right now, we think it is more easy for a person often to identify with that individual and with the way that they affected their lives, right? Like, if opposition goes up and is like, you're ordinary person speaker, these were ordinary people, commonality, I just would argue it's not true. Like, you don't live in a little grass hut anymore. Like, there are differences, but you are living in a world that was shaped by these people. That is why we are proud to propose, and that is why we propose that history as an institution is better off when it is done from that top-down approach, that trickle-down approach, rather than from the bottom up. We are proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for the speech. To open the case for the opposition, I invite the Leader of the Opposition to have the floor.
Three things in this speech. First, an idea of why we study history in the first place, why understanding ordinary people is the best way to access that, the ability to interact with those interests and why more people study history, and the last thing is why I think minority groups are effectively erased in a world where you only study leaders and those who like conquest other groups. The first thing to ask in this debate, something Bennett chose not to talk about, although he did talk about many funny things, was why the hell we study history and what its value. We argue that we study history to understand the past and to inform our present and future. So the side of this debate that's able to best access that is to say, give you the information that you as an individual are able to interact with the things around you and the world moving into the future, will win this debate. The first thing to ask then is why understanding ordinary people gives you unique insights into how the past worked, and because of that, your present. We argue there's 3 different strains to this, right? The first is we say that people's lives have been defined by culture. That is to say, like in this debate, there's going to be a little bit of a cyclical argument, which is to say that some people are going to say that institutions affect culture and that culture affects institutions back and forth. We're not going to be trying to advance the idea that institutions didn't affect culture and culture didn't affect institutions. Rather, that given that both of those influence each other, that it is preferable to focus on culture because we think that focusing on institutions or individual leaders have other systemic problems that come with them in the way that you interact with history. We say that you're able to access types of history and access the idea that you can engage with your present and moving into the future without all the problems that come with focusing on leaders and institutions, right? Now getting onto the strains. We say that one of the things that affects individual people and like their lives and are only accessible when you look at them is group interactions. That is to say that the leaders in history didn't have to care about other groups within their society. It was often authoritarian. It was often the case that they were using military power or any number of tools to ensure that they didn't have to engage with other groups within their democracy, or Jesus Christ, it wasn't a democracy, right? Like, we argue that those group interactions are often the thing that about history informs your ability to interact with the world the most. That is to say, like, subgroups within Macedonia are like how you may intergroup more, or is more likely to be relevant to how you interact with the world than Alexander the Great's conquest of the world, right? We argue the average person is unlikely to be conquesting people, but is likely to interact with other groups as far as in the same way, like maybe religion or like subtle changes in the way that you like understand the world might absolutely define the way that you have those interactions. No, thank you. We say that that's far more important. Things like class warfare are historical things that exist in many, many, many different societies that are far more relevant to the idea of, say, like Rome conquering Carthage. We argue that that's significantly more relevant. Things like racism, we argue, is in that same boat. So we say it's better for interacting with groups. No, thank you. The other thing is understanding and confirming like a shared humanity. That is to say that it is not the case that you like see Alexander the Great and get that sense of shared humanity, because like maybe you do, but your impression of Alexander the Great is necessarily one that's probably white, it's one that is male, it is one that is like, fits into your narrative or what a leader may otherwise be. But it is when you study history and when you study ordinary people that maybe are a different color or socioeconomic status from you, that you create that shared humanity and link to like the idea that maybe people who live different lives than you are still people as well. We argue that that is the value of history and it actually shapes the way that you have those interactions. Here's the thing that Bennett really misses. Serfdom is not over. The idea that people are effectively slaves is not banished from this world. We argue that it's only when you have a historical context and you understand how systems of oppression allow for systems of more oppression to exist that you're able to rationalize the fact that the stadiums in Qatar are built by slaves and that maybe that's a problem, right? That's historical context you are able to gloss over in their world. The next thing to talk about is we say, like, as a balance of probability, you're probably an ordinary person. Like, we say that the way to interact with history, therefore, is to actually is to interpret it through the lens of an ordinary person. That's to say, the way that you interact with like systems of power are likely to be similar to the ones that ordinary people interact with, right? You are unlikely to be the king of a country. MDG may be different, but for the most of us, we're not likely to be kings of countries. And so as a result, we say the way that you interact is likely to be far more likely to the ones of ordinary people. The last thing to say is that we say that these leaders monopolize resources in a way that, again, is inaccessible to most individuals. So this British upper class or Egyptian pharaohs, we say that understanding like the people who built the pyramids is significantly more relevant to you and like the systems that created that than the people who said, I want something to touch the stars. Closing.
So your contention is that for years, certain groups of people have oppressed other groups of people, and to make those oppressed groups of people more able to access culture, history, what you should do then is blame their culture for why they were oppressed.
No. The point is that you should blame like systems that exist that prevent them from accessing things like democracy and the economy and property and plenty of other like ordinary life that you're able to simply gloss over. The second thing to talk about is like why this is better for people interacting with history. Listen. I'm a computer science major and I find history thoroughly boring, right? Like, we argue that having more people feel like they can interact with history is very, very important because it shapes our ability to interact with the future. It makes people better human beings. No, thank you. I'll take you in a second, or like later. We say that interest in history is tied to a connection with it. And for all the reasons we listed before, that it's unlikely that you are a king, it's unlikely that you're likely to conquer anyone, your ability to like say, I understand what that person is going through, although like it is unlikely that you're building a pyramid, like understanding like different parts of like either oppression, class warfare, racism, like having that cultural context of the ordinary person is really, really important for your like feeling connected and likeliness to continue to study history. We say the version of history where it's just leaders is a novel. Like, you fit these people into like the idea of like, this leader conquered this, and quick bite-sized versions of history that we say are not the types of things that keep people invested. The next thing to talk about is why minorities are effectively foundation history, but first, Ben.
So often cultural biases, like anti-Semitism, for example, are created by leaders who just decide they don't want a Jewish person in their castle, for example. Why cannot we look at how cultural biases are constructed by looking at the people who constructed them?
Right, so the problem with anti-Semitism is when societies believe it, right? Like one leader being able to stand up and just say that Jews are like spreading diseases is not the problem. It's the fact that a society was able to accept that and say, we are willing to kill them. We are willing to not shelter them. We are willing to allow for a genocide to occur. And it is understanding how people let those things happen that lets us fight that in the future. And it's only when you understand the ordinary person that you interact with a way that is effective. Last thing on minorities quickly. Bennett drops the ball here when he talks about Harriet Tubman. Because recognize that in the conception of the world that government defends, Harriet Tubman is the first black person to exist in America. We say that the history of minorities exists beyond and before the leaders that we decide to care about and that we have history about. They say, well, there's not enough information on these groups. We say the reason why there isn't information is because we're not looking for it. And then furthermore, the idea that there was a shift that occurs suggests that there's information there to begin with, right? The idea that there was a shift means that we were studying something beforehand. We argue that history delegitimizes experiences of black people before like a particular leader we decided was good enough for us to care about. We say that when you think about Greek democracy, you don't think about the fact that you had to be a Greek man in order to participate in it. You just think about the place where they actually cast the votes, and we say you gloss over all the injustices that otherwise occur. We say that realistically, if 6 documents can define England, then we are happy to say that we can figure out a way to understand history of those before the leaders. Incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Thanks, Speaker, for the speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to address the House. Here.
This round is about the lens through which we understand history. We're advocating the best lens through which we understand history is from looking at the great leaders and then adjudicating how individual people reacted to those leaders and how those lives were shaped by those great institutions. The problem with the opposition side of the House is that historically, the ordinary people have had relatively little social or political power to shape the cultural forces that ended up shaping their lives. Instead, it was a relatively top-down approach where great leaders and institutions implemented policies, implemented programs that ended up shaping the lives of the ordinary people. So, if opposition side of the House thinks this round is about the best way to understand history, the best way we do that is by understanding the policies that ended up forming those cultural shifts that ended up impacting the ordinary people. The problem that has happened in academic history right now is that people have basically presumed that the best way to adjudicate those shifts is through looking at the lives of ordinary people and think that those ordinary people had some sort of power that they didn't. The reality is that historically it has not been democracies that have formed the modern day, but rather things that were extremely concentrated power systems where ordinary people were just serfs and their lives were not that interesting because all they did was like farm for their ruler and then go to bed. And the problem is that like I'm not very interested in that, and I would guess that the vast majority of people aren't either. 2 things in this debate. First, who shaped history, and second, how we encourage the study of history, because presumably those are the 2 most important things in this debate. So first on who shaped that history. I think my overview did a lot of work towards this. Why not? Yeah.
Oh, great. So we already have a lot of information on leaders and these great power structures. Why do we need to continue studying them as opposed to shift to the ordinary people to complete the narrative?
Yeah, so I think the important thing here is like the reason we have a lot of information on it is because people find it incredibly fascinating to study those rulers. So like the important thing here is because you have large amounts of information, people are much more interested in studying those individuals because they've heard about those individuals and then want to complete that narrative once they go into a history classroom because they want to get the full story about those individual leaders. But additionally, I don't think it's necessary for us to do what opposition is proposing in order to complete that narrative. Like I think we can also complete that narrative on our side of the House, but additionally, you just don't have the information oftentimes in order to complete that narrative because ordinary people produce relatively little works in history, so a lot of it is inferences. This is like a huge problem with history right now. Because you're doing like a social constructivist approach towards history where you're basically inferring what ordinary people were doing historically, it's very difficult to actually get the information necessary to complete that narrative because they weren't producing writing, because many of them were illiterate, because many of them didn't make things that give you information about that history. So at that point, it's just super hard for us to study ordinary people, which means that it undermines the perception of history as something that is valid and true, because oftentimes you have to do like storytelling essentially in order to figure out what ordinary people were actually doing. But additionally, the second argument we want to make that I think is incredibly important is how we encourage the study of history. So I think the important thing here is that it is incredibly fascinating to study the people who you perceive as incredibly important historically. So like, if you go to any elementary school, many people have heard about those great figures and therefore pursue history on the premise that they will be able to study those great figures to a further extent once they get into those history programs. So like the reason you're interested in it is because you've heard of those individuals and want to know more. So at that point, I think that's something that we would stand for on our side of the House, that we would love to encourage people to pursue that study, and on their side of the House, they get it to a much lower degree. The answer to this we get is, well, you just won't study minorities, and that's terrible. I think the problem is, on their side of the House, if they want to talk about cultural shifts, those cultural shifts were not shaped by minority individuals either. I think that's just endemic to the study of history oftentimes, which is that minority individuals were not the ones producing those works. So even if you study the ordinary people you're studying are not going to be the oppressed individuals who weren't given access to schooling or weren't given access to the tools with which to produce the documents through which we study history. So it's not like their side of the house has some unique claim to being able to study minorities. In fact, on our side of the house, I think you could study minorities through looking at the policies implemented by rulers that then affected those minorities and studying the ways in which their lives were shaped as a result of those rulers. So it's unclear to me why they have exclusive claim to that argumentation. Yeah.
Right. So if it's a case that like literally the people who are in power get control of writing, get control of history, create the texts that live on, they also get to whitewash or like effectively change the narrative that exists forever. Why should we just accept these as true instead of like trying to construct like what ordinary people live in these societies?
Yeah, so if you're arguing that they shape the narratives, it's because they're incredibly important, right? Like that's the argument that we're making. The POI just pointed that out, which is like to the extent that that person then shapes the entirety of history, we study them because it's the best way in which we understand the modern day, because presumably those individuals have created the institutions that then formed that modern day. So if the argument is like we want the best understanding of how we currently live our lives, presumably the best way to do that is by studying the individuals who created the institutions that then shape our daily lives. Like, I think this is just quite clear in terms of how you create stories about history and how you shape those things. But I also think opposition never gives you a clear conception of what their side of the house looks like. They're basically like, yeah, we would study the ordinary people in group interactions. So that falls prey to all of the argumentation I just gave you about how difficult it is to get information about history from the perspective of ordinary people. So presumably we don't have information about many of those group interactions because people weren't producing like videography like we're doing at this tournament about the ways that serfs interacted with each other historically. Instead, much of that information is just going to come from one individual person's diary, which means that you aren't going to get that widespread information about how those individuals interacted with each other. So it's unclear to me that they would have any more access to that group information on their side of the house. But I also think the other problem is that like, I just want them to paint me a picture of what this looks like at the point at which you study from a bottom-up approach of the ordinary people. I think the problem is that like in the United States, we really love to have this perspective where we have so much influence on the government and that government has a mutually reciprocal relationship with us. That is not the way history operated. I think we have to just be honest about the fact that ordinary people had little influence. The problem is when professors think that they want to shoehorn ordinary people into the academy and then basically force history to have a completely different perspective than what was actually accurate. I think the most important part of history is that you just have an accurate representation of what was happening, and the accurate representation is one in which rulers were the ones dominating those narratives, were the ones shaping the lives of individual people, and were the ones shaping those historical forces. That's what we stand for in our side of the house. And you can understand ordinary people, but the way you do it is through looking at the top-down approach of looking at those rulers first. For these reasons, proud to be on proposition.
Thank the speaker for the speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I invite the deputy of opposition to address the House. Get it.
I'm really thirsty.
No, that's all filled
Love
forever.
you so much. Eric's going to be researching that.
That was a terrifying talk.
Yeah.
I think it's really weird when Zoe gets up and tells you she wants accuracy, when the only literate people in these societies, and therefore the only people writing these sources, were often the leaders. What does this mean? It means they can essentially make stuff up, right? Like there was one source on how the conquering of Normandy went. There was one source on the 100 Years' War, which is like a massive part of British history. This was written by the winners and this was written by the leaders of these societies. I don't buy that's accurate information. They say that they fought giant snails. Like I just don't buy that's how history went down, right, guys? Like so I contest the idea that like the only way you can study these people is by having this information, because this information is wrong. What we stand for on side opposition is the fact that like, by trying to identify bits and pieces of ordinary people's lives, that's the only way you can understand both cultures, but also how leaders actually work, because the texts produced by leaders are going to be invaluable, because these are the people trying to glorify themselves, make religion links to themselves, like being religious figures, make links to Godhead. Doing what's a clear conception of what we stand for on our side of the house, we stand for like looking at like how like peasants like lived and worked, how like you know, what it was like being a soldier in the trenches in World War I, like what it was like to be a Jew hiding from the Nazis, all of those sort of experiences, right? We think that that's the way we should correctly study history. Okay, so let's start with this information point. We have 5 separate points of rebuttal to this. First thing, there was relatively little information about like society before like the majority of society was literate, right? So if you really don't believe that information delegitimizes study society, you wouldn't study anything before 1500 because there's just not that much information about it anyway, right? Given that we still think it's important to study societies despite the dearth of information, we do recognize there are things other than information that make a society worth studying. And they're going to come out and they're going to go, well, on balance, like we think that there's more information about like the leaders. Given that the analysis I've given this information is incredibly accurate, we think you can construct like a similarly accurate perception of the culture through things like what sort of like what do their houses look like what would they like to go doing and work every day. We think like where they were living. We think like even though this information is sparse, given the information that you're getting on those houses is inaccurate anyway, you're likely to be able to take an equally accurate picture of how these people live. So we think that but furthermore, we think that this is the only way to get accurate pictures about these leaders in the end, right? Because we think that like all leaders in their text that they get to write, when there's only one text and say, I was great, I was super nice, like all the peasants, it was a great time. We think this is probably likely to be very inaccurate. So to the extent you actually want to understand the influence of these people, how in history, you must understand the culture first, because that's the only way to actually understand how they ever lived or interacted. Okay. So then the second, yeah, sure.
So part of studying great rulers is also studying the criticism that was produced of those rulers. Presumably then, we would have other sources that would document those criticisms. Why can't we have a critical perspective of great rulers while also celebrating them?
Because the criticism is defined by their culture, right, guys? Like, in order to understand why people criticize, why leaders were well and unpopular, you have to look at the cultural forces. This is the chicken and the egg problem that David gave you. One thing influences the other in perpetuity. We think that given that, all the reason I'm giving you, it's important to shift focus onto culture, given that we already have inflation. And these leaders, no thanks. So we want to spend a lot of time talking about how little people have very little roles in shaping the way institutions change. So firstly, I don't think that the study of history is only in the changing of institutions, right? I think that you can have lots of value understanding how people lived and how people work, but isn't about massive cultural shift. Why do we think this is important? We think it's important because it allows people to understand how the ancestors lived, which has great personal value to individuals, allows them to understand their role in society better. We think it's also about understanding where you come from and why the group you ends up where they are today. You black people didn't the fact that black people lived in slavery is incredibly important to African Americans today, right? It doesn't matter that the slaves you're studying didn't revolt or didn't cause the ending of slavery. That still information is still just as important. So it doesn't have to be the great moves of shaping history in order to have value in studying them. But we also think that but we also think that actually culture does have a massive impact on the leaders. Recognize that the majority of Europe was monarchies, and that shaped out very differently in different countries, even though the structure of power was the same. We don't think that's only because different kings were incompetent. We think that's because in different cultures it plays out very, very differently. We think understanding culture is the only way that you can understand why these things happen. And we think the reason that people will individuals will always have influence on culture, irrespective of how much active power they have. It's when you're a numerical majority, even if people your leaders and your kings have to divert to you, otherwise figure out some sort of system to control you in order to maintain their power, right? Therefore, even if you can't vote, even if you're very poor, because there are a lot of you, and European people are appointed, your society depends, the economy depends, the army depends, leaders are going to have to interact and shape you. The fact, the way that leaders do that is determined, and what's going to be effective is determined by culture. So we think that, for example, in America during the Red Scare, the fact that that was an effective way to control the people is determined by American culture at the time, how they felt about the communists, how their experiences from World War II, right? We therefore think that to understand how leaders could govern in such a way you need to understand the people. So then they told us that great figures are more interesting. I just don't buy that's true, right? I think a person who decided an African American who was on the Underground Railway is probably quite interesting to people, right? Individuals have extraordinary lives, even if they don't shape culture that people can very well engage with. But on this, we think particularly if you're a minority, you're probably more likely to be interested in how people you used to live, right? We don't think that Alexander the Great feels particularly relevant to individuals in Macedonia today. They're probably more interested in people that look like them, that act like them, that they can draw their cultural ties to. We think the leaders are exclusively white. So now let's talk about. So I think this also cuts against those who ask people need this to get into history. If you think history is a study of people, if you think history is something that is irrelevant to you, you're not going to be interested in studying it. If we can prove that this shuts out minorities or this shuts out the people aren't going to get into history. So let's talk about why this shuts out minorities. So recognize that even if this is an incredibly marginal impact, we're always going to win this to the extent that there are groups that don't have leaders, that have communal or
You know why?
Yeah, sure.
These groups do have leaders. They have not yet been studied. Wouldn't it be beneficial to start doing that?
Okay, 3 responses to this. Firstly, in societies which aren't like majority Western or have like atypical structures of power, you need to understand the culture and to identify who the leader was in the first place. Secondly, it's just not true that all societies have leaders. Like often, like specific like Native Aborigines people, like Native American tribes, have people. Like, that's the way their society operates. You cannot study these people who study institutions or leaders. And thirdly, we think that it's only, like I said, it's only through understanding how a culture works that you can identify things that are important later, right? Like, different people might have been influential on culture for very culture-specific reasons. You have to understand that culture. So let's very quickly turn to the minority point. First, like minorities didn't produce cultural shifts. I posit that like every person who fought a liberation movement probably created their own cultural shift, and it's probably quite relevant to study. Secondly, we think that like even if it is true that like even if you buy all the analysis of like white people have been like the sole arbiter of like how black people live, which I think is quite offensive, I don't think that many black people are going to like that narrative. I don't think they're going to engage with that. I don't think that like black people are going to appreciate that the only way you can study them is through policies that were implemented upon them by white people, right? I think that's likely to create disengagement. Very quickly, in response to a POI we heard earlier from closing about like, oh, you blame their culture. We think there's a difference between like studying someone's culture and understanding how they live and saying that they're responsible. So we think when you study white culture in America, you can blame that for slavery as opposed to blaming black culture in America for slavery. We're very proud to.
Thank you, speaker, for the speech. Now to begin the second half of the debate, I invite the member of government to take the floor.
When closing opposition POI trying to have their cake and eat it too, the response to them is exactly OO's contention that there is a problem in the study of history and that it has for years marginalized groups of minorities. It is not the case that these groups do not have leaders. Under Diallo's own explanation of how some of these groups, note some of these groups, work and their structures, well, what's that word there? Structures, institutions based on which these groups run in a unity kind of way. All of these things are crucial to understanding these groups. When OG tell you that history is better understood through institutions and through great individuals, that holds as true for minorities as it does for the general, the majority society who has oppressed those minorities. So when OO tell you they want to study these minority societies, it is still the case that doing so is better off through the prism of institutions and through the prism of great leaders. 3 arguments from closing government. 1, on how history shapes the course of the lives of individuals. 2, on how history shapes the course of the lives of groups. And 3, on path setting, why history is just more accurate via the institutions and leaders. Before that, 1 point of, 2 points of refutation. 1 on the entire analysis as to why culture is important in understanding history. When David, am I right, is it David? When David tells you that institutions and culture are chicken and egg, what he's essentially telling you is that most of what, Zoe, right? No, Bobby. Yeah, no, I'm getting it. That most of what Bobby tells you can be gleaned via our institutions as well, given that they are logically dependent one on the other. So most of that speech we just heard is just true on both sides of the house. 1 more point of refutation on the difference between institutions and culture. We think a lot of what David says there is true, but there's 1 crucial difference, and that is who creates and shapes those things. Cultures are by definition created by everyone together, which means created by no one person. This means collective, let's say, fault or responsibility depending on what that culture is. Institutions are created initially by those same great individuals who we're talking about on our side of the house. So while there is a distinct connection between why we grouped together great leaders and institutions and individuals and culture, and we think that hasn't yet been touched upon. So let's first talk about how this affects individual people. See, no. I mean, can you put that over here, please? Yeah, absolutely. See, They stand up and tell us the purpose of history is to enable people to act and react within their current society. To the extent that's true, we think the arguments we give you about how this affects people and enables them to move on are probably the most important arguments in the round by OO's own metric. Let's talk about individuals. We say that acting based on institutions empowers individuals to act. Why is that the case? When you say that there is a line of how things work, which is a culture, shapes the life of an individual so that an individual is forced to react or live in a certain way, what you're essentially are advocating for is a deterministic point of view which says that the individual, in the bottom of it all, has very little ability to influence the course of their own life. Now, what David wants to say right now is by studying the individual, we actually get the ability to see how an individual affects his own life, right? But if that individual did manage to have a positive and real effect, that individual would either be at the heart of an institution or one of those great leaders. By definition, the individuals that they want us to study are those who had little to no effect on the course of their own lives, those whose lives were shaped entirely by the culture around them. So their study of history means that we disempower individuals to shape their own future and to shape their own lives. Oh.
Culture in everyday life is equivalently hard to determine for all groups, but studying leaders is not. Studying winners, colonizers, and those who use writing is significantly easier. Why doesn't this lead to a significantly worse skew as far as what we study in history on your side than ours?
Okay, A, we disagree that studying institutions is difficult in any way. B, we disagree that it is that hard to study minority leaders. It is true that to an extent history is written by the winners, but there have always been historians writing against those winners. Josephus, for example, has been a historian writing against many winners and giving us the prism on those, let's call them losing sides. Secondly, let's talk about how this affects group ability. We're glad that Bobby decided to answer this at 7 minutes and 7 seconds in her speech. We think probably not a lot of that is going to stand at the end of this. You know what? Yeah, sure, before that.
Yeah, so why does it disempower individuals to talk about the average college students who got on buses to go to Freedom Summer in the South and register black people to vote?
So we think those individuals were united together by someone organizing that rally. That person is a leader who should be studied. The peons at the bottom, much like these soldiers, are just not that interesting as an individual. Each and every one of them did not have a big effect. Let's talk about cultures. At the point at which you tell an individual it is culture that has shaped your life, you have to recognize that there were historical moments where some countries became superior to other countries, either by reality or by perception. There is nothing, we claim, unique about Western European culture, which means they were able to create the Industrial Revolution. Instead, there are individuals who happen to invent specific things in that culture which enabled that revolution and created institutions to support that revolution. By saying that there is something different in the culture, you are saying that that something different is shaped by each individual within that culture. You are then saying that the cultures of East Asia and the cultures of Africa are inferior in that they did not enable these progresses that were enabled otherwise. Now you can argue that these aren't really progress, that this is really like just cultural bias. But the truth is the likelihood of you convincing anyone that the Industrial Revolution isn't actual progress, that controlling other groups isn't a form of power is quite unlikely. So when you blame this on their culture, you disenable them to react and act within their current culture today more so, and disempower them more. For these reasons, please propose the motion.
I thank the speaker for the speech. I invite the member of the opposition to have the floor.
History isn't dead, and Daddy and I aren't going to tell you about some distant past of kings and castles. Rather, we're going to move beyond this chicken and egg debate of whether the people or the leaders came first, and tell you about the societies where history is the most alive. Tell you about the societies where the narration of history, the stories we choose to tell about ourselves, matter the very most. 3 points in this section. Firstly, national identity, how it's constructed and where it matters. Secondly, restorative obligations, how we get them and why they're so important. And thirdly, social movements if I have time. Rebuttal will come afterwards. Cool. Firstly then, national identity. We tell you that the societies where history matters the very most are ones where the questions of conflict and colonialism and national identity are ones still relevant to the present day. It's where questions like, how does South Africa choose to narrate the anti-apartheid struggle become really important? How does Kenya choose to narrate the situation of the Mau Mau emergency? How does India choose to narrate the role of the Congress Party and Nehru and Gandhi in achieving their own independence? What we tell you is that historians have a question, historians have a choice. Historians get to choose how that construction of national identity is created and how it is narrated. And the question in this debate is what the focus of their attention should be. Should the focus of their attention be on rulers and the institutions they construct, or rather on culture and ordinary people? We tell you in these situations it's infinitely preferable to choose the latter. It's infinitely preferable to choose ordinary South Africans rather than aggrandizing the ANC over all else. It's preferable to choose ordinary Kenyans who bravely took the ordinary Kikuyu who bravely took the oath in the 1950s rather than just talk about Jomo Kenyatta and Dedan Kimathi. 2 key impacts of this. No thanks. The first thing is it means right now, in present societies, the kind of groups people vote for are more skewed on their side of the house towards these aggrandizing narratives and less on our side of the house. A concrete instantiation of this is somewhere like South Africa, where right now the ANC still rides, no thank you, on the aggrandization of Nelson Mandela in order to persuade real people right now to vote for them when it's often against their own economic self-interest, even though Jacob Zuma is often grotesquely corrupt. What we do when we envision history that empowers ordinary people is we say, you shouldn't be tied to the leaders of the past, you shouldn't be tied to people who try to claim those mantles of the leaders of the past, rather you should be tied to your own collective ability to empower yourselves. When we tell history through that lens, that is what we get. And this ties more generally, no thank you, to the duty that historians have. Because Danny and I tell you that historians have a particular duty that's not been covered yet in this debate. And that's their duty not to reproduce the inequities of the past, rather to acknowledge the structural imbalances that we've seen in the past and do something towards correcting those things. Particularly that duty is uniquely fulfilled by this really important thing. And if you want to talk about impact in this debate, this is realistically the most impactful point you're going to get. No, thank you. We get a lot of sort of, gesturing about like academia and truth and accuracy and validity, I'm going to tell you later on. But realistically, this is what moves people to the polling booth. This is what gets people out of fucking poverty. That has to matter. Second, let's chat about restorative obligation. Before that, I'll take Zoe.
So presumably Jacob Zuma is celebrated by the people, not because they've read a lot of historians talking about Jacob Zuma. Presumably then, can't we have criticism produced by historians of the aggrandizement of Jacob Zuma, but won't people be more interested in it because it's about a strong figure in their lives?
Okay, so 2 things. A, just in terms of the role of the economy, clearly the economy trickles down to the rest of society, so that's reasonably important. Secondly, on criticising leaders, if you're still operating through the framework of leaders, then the criticism is going to be things like Jacob Zuma isn't living up to Nelson Mandela, which doesn't deal with the key form of aggrandization of individuals more generally, specifically the ANC. But even if in the best case scenario you discredit the ANC, then you're still just viewing a form of history where individuals should be led by authoritarian leaders, which I think is just never a helpful view of history more generally to have. Secondly, restorative obligations. Ultimately, history is filled with crimes, which is a tragedy but something we can do nothing about. I come from the UK, we've done a hell of a lot in the course of our history in a pretty crappy way. The question then is how we mediate, no thank you, those narratives and how we adjust them. There are 2 choices, once more. We can talk about the morality of individual leaders. We can say that the immorality of the British Empire was as a result of people like Winston Churchill being really bad people, or the immorality of the Holocaust, which is Hitler led the German people astray. Or you can recognise that actually things like genocide and empire are a hell of a lot more complex than that. Things like genocide and empire involve complicity by tens of millions of people, and only then is it possible, only in that kind of situation, you see the sheer scale of the crime we see right now. That actually, all the settlers in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising were anything more culpable than the British government for some of the atrocities that were committed. Only if you do that, no thank you, can you move towards a narrative of these events that allows things like reparations to happen, that says no, it wasn't just the fact that we had one terrible ruler, but rather our society as a whole was pregnant with this sin. Once we do that, then we can start trying to do things like reparations and atone for that kind of guilt. Look, in moral terms, this is probably the most important point in this debate. We all accept these crimes are awful. We should all accept there's a huge moral debt that exists in our society that hasn't been repaid right now. In constructing history, we should do so in such ways to repay that moral debt, and only our side does that. Thirdly, and finally, I want to chat about social movements. This directly engages what we get out of their side. Realistically, people say who constructed social movements look to the past to decide how to do that. 3 errors they make when they do so that are particularly bad. Firstly, they see it as simply impossible for mass movements to be created by ordinary people. note the fact that so many of the leaders we see are viewed as amazing or superhuman or wonderful. Right? People are seen as great and with capacities beyond those of ordinary humans when they're aggrandized by historical study. Rather than we recognize that social movements are led by ordinary people, people feel like they can stop that. Secondly, this is often whitewashed in a grotesque fashion. Note the narration of the abolition of slavery in the early 1800s, where people talk about William Wilberforce, a bunch of old white men coming to Parliament and basically solving slavery. They ignore the incredibly important no thank you role of things like slave uprising in the Caribbean in doing that. If we actually provide narrations of history aggrandized ordinary people, also marginalized people, then we can get far more powerful social movements. Thirdly and finally, in more practical terms, we think actually this is a more accurate representation of these movements and therefore better for narration. I'll say closing.
When you teach atrocities as based in cultures, you make people more likely to not view them as atrocities, but as part of their culture, and B, make them less likely to feel empowered to next time try and prevent the atrocity because they feel like they're deterministically falling into it.
Realistically, there's a degree of culture involved in these atrocities. The question is how one atones. Whether one does like what Germany's done and genuinely try to move on and alters one national culture accordingly, or do what Poland's done, where you simply ignore that, ignore the cultural role that's played, and still have grotesque anti-Semitism persisting to the present day, electing neo-fascists because you don't have cultural adjustment that's necessary through a cultural rather than great man understanding of history. Let's deal with that. Firstly, it tells us individual determination, disempowers individuals. Again, nonsense. Note the fact that individuals collectively can do things beyond the sum of their parts. That's the entire notion of history when erasing. They then tell us that individuals have little to no effect anyway. Again, entirely untrue. Note things like Mau Mau Oathings, which were started at the grassroots by ordinary people in Kenya, had a huge historical effect. They then tell us that this deems cultures inferior when you tie things to culture. They give you the example of the Industrial Revolution. Nonsense. That's to do with geography, the distribution of natural resources, like which cattle were found in particular areas that led to societies evolving in a more natural way. That has nothing to do with culture. That's simply ridiculous. Most of what we hear on OG, about kind of history as academic study, is effectively rebutted. The only thing they say is history is really important if you talk about great men. Presumably that's about how you present it. There are interesting ways to present it on our side of the house. If anything, naturally more on our side of the house because we're talking about ordinary people. The people who are reading that history are also ordinary people. Look at the end of this debate. Danny and I don't need the only truly impactful extension of this debate. We have to win it.
And thanks, Speaker, for the speech. Now, to close the debate for the government, I invite the whip to address the House.
Three things I'm going to do in this debate. I'm going to talk about the idea of accuracy, where we get the most amount of accurate history. I'm going to talk about accountability, and then I'm going to talk about minority voices and how they're heard. Before that, the idea of inspiring people, that I think is subversive to accuracy, so I'm going to talk about it there. Before that, a couple of responses to the case that we just heard. So first of all, it should note that if they want to run a case which is essentially history changes every single interaction that we have today and it trickles down through the academia, then some analysis on how history trickles down from the academia, which is what this debate is about, into the general population as a whole would be helpful. Why does it me writing some kind of paper in some dusty attic actually create any of the changes or the movements that they're doing? Without that, without any ability to engage with that analysis as it were to come about, we think that closing are in a bit of a pickle. But even if you think that there is something to be said there, we think that there is probably less of an effect on the trickle-down effect than there is actually in the academia world and the kind of things that it does, so it's unclear why we'd necessarily prioritize that. But you know what, let's take it at its best, right? And let's say a few things. They say, look, Nelson Mandela. What I don't understand is why can't both people on both sides of the house lay claim to Nelson Mandela? In fact, that's exactly what happened, right? Both people, both sides of the debate in South Africa lay claim to be continuing Nelson Mandela and continuing his path. So that's kind of a wash, right? The idea is that you can simply use these leaders to simply push things across isn't necessarily the reason why South African authoritarian sort of governments stay in control. That's because they have other means of power in which they do so. So we don't necessarily think that this is very impactful to begin with. So now let's get on to the things that I actually want to talk about. So let's talk first of all about the idea of accuracy. So on the first side, in the opening half, we get an idea of that there is a lack of information. So we get on one hand from Oshi, there's a lack of information on individual people, on individuals, and therefore we can't create an accurate picture of history. From OO, they tell us, no, we actually lack information on leaders. At the end of the day, we probably don't have enough information on either side, but maybe there is slightly more information on leaders, which is just skewed more in their favor. What we tell you, however, is that actually it's important to understand leaders because of path dependence. Because the decisions that leaders make and the institutions that they create do actually make significant changes. Like, it's a bit weird that they just poo-poo the idea of the Industrial Revolution. No, that's because of geography. When, like, most historians today look at certain areas in China which say, they have the exact kind of geographic ramifications which are very similar to what goes on in the UK, and the Industrial Revolution didn't develop there. Also note that the UK was in a very similar cultural state for like hundreds of years, and the Industrial Revolution didn't break out. It was an individual decision to create, in this case it was the steam engine, which actually created the very starting of the Industrial Revolution. Notice that these kind of decisions are incredibly important. The decision to create the Cortes in Spain meant that this institution wasn't strong enough to fight with it, to balance out the power of the King of Spain, meaning he was more likely to raise taxes and use the gold coming in and destroy the Spanish economy overall. These are things which are important for us to understand going forward. It's not a question of information, it's a question of this actually informs us of what the correct decisions are to make. And if we want to understand history, and we want to understand and make, understanding of what we want to do today, we need to understand these decision making at these points in time. Now, moreover than that, we say that studying only the and this is where inspiration comes subversive to it. If you only look at the cultural ramifications of every single individual and their very minimal effect on history, this is uninspiring, right? Like, this is not something which enables us to be interested, because this isn't people who have actually informed and created the decision which changes, which is why we think that this doesn't create the kind of narrative and the buy-in to history that both sides seem to want. Yes?
So the argument we made was not that, like, there's a difference in the information between leaders and the culture, right? We argue that it's equivalently hard to determine and talk about culture historically across all groups, while it is not the case that it's hard equivalently to talk about all leaders, and as a result you get a skew in the type of leaders you're going to talk about. Can you engage with that version of it?
Yeah, sure, let's get on to minorities. Right, so OO tell us, look, there's a problem here because of that it is difficult to understand different leaders, different places. Okay, let's pretend for a second that's true. Just look at the comparative here. White people have tons of historical leaders today, right? Because we've studied them all. Many other minorities do not have these leaders and they had leaders, but we don't know about these leaders and we don't know them. Therefore, if we never study them and we never do any of them, even if it's particularly difficult to do so, which we don't buy, no thank you, then this means that then historically going forward, we don't have these leaders, we don't have these people. Specifically, this also means that it skews history to the idea that, like, white people had inspirational people going forward, whereas minorities were just this blob of cultural people, none of whom actually had a major effect altogether. This is a problem because this is the narrative going forward, right? Because that's what was actually informed by us. No thanks. Which means that we think, and to answer Theo, we think Kenya had leaders, right? Like, we think that the uprising in Kenya had leaders that we should study and that we should relate to. No thank you. We think that that's important for us to understand who these people were and how they created these kind of things. On both sides, minorities are going to be marginalized, right? But it's better to be able to point to individual leaders inside minority groups to inspire people from inside those minority groups, and also others as well who can be inspired from them because they are people who inspire us all in all. Yes? No, sorry, second, yeah.
Question. Cool. So, is the logic that an acephalous society cannot exist and every society should have a leader, we just need to find it, the exact logic behind indirect rule and colonialism and all the atrocities we're trying to atone for?
Okay, so let's get on to accountability. Right, this is great. Let's get on to accountability, right? Like the idea of accountability and how this goes forward. So look at this. It's really funny here. Poland, according to the member, blamed history and blamed history for what happened there, whereas Nazi Germany owned what happened, blamed its institution, blamed Hitler, blamed the leaders, blamed the weak constitution, and therefore created a new constitution, which they now find really, really holy and rich, right? They created new institutions which would enable them to not then fall back into Nazism, as opposed to Poland, because here's the idea. When everybody's responsible, nobody is, right? And that's the kind of Polish interaction, that they say, no one's responsible for the rampant anti-Semitism and the gassing of the millions of Jews. It's not our problem. It was historical. And this is the problem when people don't take accountability. Because again, what we said back at the beginning about how path dependence actually informed us going forward, that's actually important to understand it, not in this airy-fairy way, but if we actually want to stop the atrocities which clothing are talking about, then we need to understand the institutions which enabled those atrocities, right? It wasn't just cultural phenomenon, it was for specific people, it was Hitler getting up there and creating this situation which led Nazi Germany to commit the atrocities that they have and the weak institution which enabled him to do so. So at the end of the day, both sides of the House get in this cyclical nature some kind of understanding of history, right? The only question is, A, do we get minority leaders and therefore the ability to inspire minorities only under our side of the House? And do we get information which informs us and the ability to move forward and correct for past mistakes only on our side of the House? It's a clear win, guys. Thanks.
I thank the whip for the speech, and now to close the debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip to address the House. Go ahead.
There is a way out of this debate without getting into the endless cycle of which comes first, the people or their leaders. What we told you is there are many different accurate ways to study history. Rather, the question is, what is the unique value of studying and adding this particular perspective to the historical narrative? 3 things in this speech. First, what we introduced to you in closing opposition and the actual impact of this historical study. Secondly, dealing with the closing government material about empowering individuals and the notions of progress. And then lastly, dealing with opening government. So on closing opposition extension, how do we frame this debate? Because opening government says it's just about accuracy, but that's insufficient because it's not an exclusive way of adjudicating the debate. But there are many different ways we can value accuracy, like who has the most accurate slave narratives or who has the most accurate picture of someone like Hamilton. The question is, which of those multiple accurate methods is the most valuable? Opening opposition tells you that it's the study of the past to inform the future, but we say that understates the connection that history actually has to the future. Because it's not just like, oh, what do we learn about the future, but what are ways the historical narrative actually shapes people's lived experiences, and what is the role of an academic in a larger community that they are responsible to? So what did we bring to you? We told you how this actually happens. The first challenge we get from closing government is that how does this actually trickle down to affect people? So the first thing to say is that some of the material is not even contingent on that, because just getting information about how ordinary people are implicated in things like the slave trade and how that ties to then organizations that have to pay reparations like Georgetown helps us get change. Or just getting things like people studying like the way ordinary people got involved in social movements and social leaders of today understanding that how they can do that to get ordinary people involved in their social movements does not require like everyone to understand this history. But secondly, like history often does permeate the common culture. Like we see things like reviews of important controversial historical works entering things like the New York Times, and then people talking about that, the people going on TV. You even have a musical that's the most popular called Alexander Hamilton, meaning that there are ways this permeates the pop culture. The way then is how do we make sure that actually impacts that? And I would also say like the history from the bottom-up narrative does impact the exact things they're talking about, like Hamilton, because you talk about people like Hercules Mulligan or like the slave uprisings in the actual movie. Like the whole, like the end of the movie is who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Like that is a narrative thing for us. Like whatever. So we do get trickle down. But what did Archie actually bring to you? 3 things. First, national movements. This is important because this articulates where this history is actually the most important, something that no other team in this debate has done. The problem is not that one side is claiming a monopoly on a leader. The problem is that in a country like South Africa or Kenya or India, the way you make appeals to people is by appealing to one leader and what they would want. This appeal to authority, which implicitly condones the power structures in place that one person has a claim on what the national movement is, rather than allowing people to define them for themselves. That's why the closing government response of how both sides can claim to Nelson Mandela is insufficient for actually dealing with it, because it doesn't shape the way the narrative actually shapes authority. Second thing Archie brought you, which we didn't hear any response to, is how we generate political capital for restorative obligations. And as I told you, this doesn't require this to permeate pop culture. Just Georgetown, because it's understanding slavery now creating a scholarship program for African Americans is the type of tangible change we can get on our side of the house, because we understand the way ordinary people were impacted by the great leaders and institutions that they wanted to actually talk about. Their response is that, no, in Germany, this means you don't change your constitution, because if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. Like, that's silly. No one's going to forget about Hitler on either side of the house. The question, though, is Hitler only capable because of his individual capacities or the individual capacities of the Nazi Party, which is problematic because then the only focus is like denazification and getting rid of those specific people, or is it that it extends beyond those people to other people who are complicit, and when do we recognize this type of complicity? This is the whole reason why like one of the most powerful narratives of the Holocaust is like, first he came for the Jews, but I was not Jewish, so I didn't care, but then he came for me and no one was left. That is what we get on our side of the house, because we recognize the individual's ordinary role in these harms. Third thing, social movements. We told you there's a lot to learn, because it's not just about things like Martin Luther King was a very effective orator. It was also that like thousands of people got on buses down to the South to go register people to vote. It's things like thousands of people participated in the Montgomery bus boycott. The reason why that is valuable to study is because there are also organizers who aren't effective. Like there are all the people in like Greenpeace that like aren't creating a mass movement, or like all the people who want gun control that aren't getting anything done. The question is like, why are some very talented individuals more successful than other very talented individuals? We say the deciding point in that is the ordinary people that get involved in these movements, and studying their stories, why they did that, how they did that, is a great lesson for future ways of getting social movements opening.
Great figures are going to be popular culturally on either side of the house. If that's the case, isn't it the role of academia to produce that criticism of the popular figure that is popular culturally?
We criticize it by understanding the way ordinary people were affected by those people. Like, do you write another book on Jefferson's Notes of Virginia, because that's easy to access, or do you write a book about the slaves of Monticello? That's what we get on our side of the house. Dealing with responses to closing government's extension. So our response to the individual empowerment is collective action is empowering. It shows that ordinary people are able to shape the world. The response to the POI is, well, there was someone organizing that. But I think that's way more disempowering of individuals to say the only reason things got done was because one person was able to tell a bunch of other people what to do, as if they had no impact on their own. But in terms of this narrative of economic progress that we blame individuals, so like, firstly, even if individual leaders make an impact on things like tax structure or whatever, we say that that's not as important, because economics is an entire system of widespread trade and commerce. So we also have to think about like who was buying and selling things, who was willing to take economic risks to make investments. We get that by understanding the ordinary people. But it's not like we give up on the Industrial Revolution, or we say that people in China didn't experience colonialism, because we recognize that like people there also did things like invent gunpowder for the first time. So it's not just a question of invention, it's a question of how the widespread movements are actually impacted. Now dealing with openings material. So there was already responses to the fact that it's interesting. I think that's irresolvable, because people also find things like slave narratives interesting as well, or like other things interesting. And in terms of little information, I would just say like we can build best practices for doing this. Like we can corroborate something written in a diary, or we can corroborate things with DNA testing, or if we can see if like one thing in the diary is false, maybe we will cast doubt on the other things we're using to get a narrative. But in terms of this great figure view of history, the biggest problem with this is, first, it's a question of the shift. Like we have already studied these great figures. Why do we need to continue to do so, as opposed to add the additional perspective of the person from the bottom up? That's what we introduced to you on Closing Opposition, because it's uniquely able to get these benefits that we haven't already achieved, like restorative obligations, addressing best practices for social movements, and understanding that it's not just these great leaders, but individual people, so we need to stop valorizing them the way we currently do. For those reasons, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you everyone for the debate. Please cross the house and shake hands and take